newsletters. They deliver unique information that people aren't getting in other spots. And I think that is something that the best newsletters are very good at. It's super important to have an expectation to reality match. So one of the things I coach folks through when we're starting out is to be very, very intentional at saying, each Friday at 8 a.m. PST, I'm going to send you a case study of how to scale your e-commerce store from 0 to 1 million. You're going to deliver it at the same time every single week, and you're going to tell someone exactly what it's about.
Is there a number of times that somebody should be sending an email out? Once a week, once a month, every other week? Or is it more about just being consistent with whatever you decide?
Yeah, it's more about being consistent.
Okay.
And the reality is it's about how often you can message people with quality content.
What about from like a legal perspective? Is there anything that you need to be aware of, like GDPR or anything like that? What other like legal considerations does somebody need to consider when writing a newsletter? In today's episode, we're joined by Casey Hill. Casey is a growth veteran with over a decade of experience in helping software companies scale fast. Whether it's garnering 10 million plus views across LinkedIn, Reddit, and Quora, or pioneering a new growth lever like booking his team on hundreds of podcasts, Casey is always looking for creative and value-led ways to grab attention and break from the mold. In his current role, leading growth at ActiveCampaign, he is building organic growth engines to propel the team to 1 billion in ARR. On the consulting side, Casey works with some of the world's biggest firms, including places like McKinsey, BlackRock, Coleman's, GLG, GuidePoint, and more, where he provides institutional guidance to PE and VC teams around topics such as SMB marketing selection, SaaS pricing, SaaS marketing, CRM tool differentiation, market analysis, inbound marketing, and marketing automation. He also teaches classes at UCSD and the Stanford Extension around demand creation, email marketing, and content marketing. Join us today as we dive into the world of email marketing as Casey teaches us why most B2B newsletters suck and how you can fix yours moving forward. Welcome to the show, Casey.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to have you. As we were kind of just talking offline, I love following you on LinkedIn. You know, we've had a lot of really awesome people on the podcast around a lot of different topics. We've had one email and SMS expert in the beginning, and looking at your history and stuff, man, I'm excited to learn. It's an area that I have managed in the past, but never really dove into enough to like feel like super, super confident. So before we jump into that though, let's learn a little bit about who Casey is. So where'd you grow up? What'd you want to be when you were little? And how'd you go from that to where you're at today?
Yeah, that's fair. So I'm from Southern California. I've lived in California all my life at different spots. I went to college up in Berkeley and then have kind of made my way down. I live in San Diego now. And from a young age, I always wanted to be a writer. That was my aspiration. I've written a couple books, not published anything yet. So it's kind of under wraps, but I love writing. And that's one of the things that kind of got me into marketing eventually. Mm-hmm. I got into the tech field young. So actually when I was in college, I started doing my first internships, worked for a company called Tech Validate that got acquired by SurveyMonkey. And that kind of set me on the course of working a lot in that B2B and SaaS industry. And then I've kind of dabbled in a lot of things. You know, I launched a Kickstarter in 2018 for a card game. We're 800% funded, and then went through a couple of phases of that business. I've done a lot of consulting, both with small businesses directly, but also on an institutional level. So working with like Series A, Series B companies, and consulting a lot in the marketing automation space and the email marketing space, which is where I've kind of spent the majority of the last decade. And then recently I've kind of been dabbling in teaching, which has kind of come in the last, I think I started my first unit was a year and a half ago. Wow. So just kind of got started there, and that's been a lot of fun as well.
It's quite the rap sheet, man. There's a lot to dig in there. Let's talk about your book. Are you willing to talk about like your book or books or what they are? Or are you planning to publish them? Are they fiction? Are they nonfiction? Give us everything you're willing to and able to give us without like messing up the surprise when it actually comes out.
Yeah, so there's two. Right.
Okay.
So there is a fiction book. Fiction piece is called Dreamweaver. It has an interesting play on magic. Magic system essentially consists of whenever someone uses magic, they exhaust a memory that has a related emotion. So there's a lot of interplay on like how we change based on that, right? Like if you lose your strongest memory, either positive or negative, what does that do to the identity of a person? So I think there's some cool interactions and kind of play with that. So that's the fiction piece. And then also on the business front, it's an interesting story. I won't go down the rabbit hole, but essentially I wrote a book and my whole premise was my problem with literature in the business space is it's very theory and it's very framework based. And the challenge I've always seen in this industry is we need to get people to an actual outcome. And oftentimes there's so much missing in the actual execution. Like if I talk someone through how to get on podcast, I can't just say, hey, go send a personalized pitch, right? They need to know, how do I get the actual email address? How do I find the right podcast? Like all of those pieces are key. So what I've always tried to do is be like, no, if I'm going to tell someone how to get on podcasts, I'm going to show them how to go on listen notes. I'm going to show them how to set the filters. I'm going to show them the exact steps to get to the execution layer. So I've gone about building a book, taking some of those blueprints from courses that I built and kind of combining them. The challenge from a publishing perspective is publishers are very leery of things that don't age well over time because those individual tools that I'm talking about could go out of business, right? And so that's why they push people towards frameworks. But it's a little bit of the gap that I've seen, I guess, in industry is I think an execution or actionable layer content is really valuable. So I'm still thinking through how we get out that type of content while still allowing it to age a little bit.
Well, I can relate to that one. I think that one of the things I love most about this podcast is in the tactical section, we talk a lot about the how, right? Because every consultant, every agency, every person in the digital space, it's easy for them to say, oh, you should go and do this. But if you're a new business owner or an up and coming marketer, you're like, okay, like conceptually, I get that. But like, how do I do that? So I love that you're diving into that. What's stopping you from self-publishing?
I could. I actually was going to work with a partner at one point and do it. I think part of it's just time, right? Like there's only so many plates and I actually had a lot more kind of, I guess, side businesses or side gigs at my last opportunity. When I joined Active Campaign, I really honed in and I kept the teaching because I was like, I can't turn down Stanford. But besides that, I've kind of tuned down a lot of those outside things and just laser focused at the big goal. But sometime when I have some extra bandwidth, I'll dive back into it. And I'm not opposed to self-help for sure.
Yeah, that makes sense. I have this behind me, a children's book that me and my wife self-published, and it's not that hard to self-publish. There are some steps you have to know, but I understand, the promotion of it has to be thought through and all of that. So I just want you to do it because I want to read it. So as soon as it's out, you just let me know and I'll pick it up and read it. I think it'll be super helpful.
I love it. And if you ever go the crowd funding route with your kid's book, let me know. I'm happy to give you input from my experience going through the Kickstarter system.
Heck yeah, that's awesome. What do you think it was as a kid that made you want to be a writer? Was it like, did your parents give you like tasks to like write in your journal or something at school that like sparked that? What do you think it was that gave you that knack?
Yeah. So I come from an entrepreneurial family. My dad ran companies his whole life, is still running companies. My grandpa started a 500-person company. My cousin runs a company. So I came from a family of entrepreneurs. And my dad, definitely kind of a atypical kind of style. He was a huge storyteller. So he was always reading us books. He was making up his own books. And those were kind of bedtime stories growing up. And I think I just grew up in a family that celebrated creativity, celebrated all sorts of manifestations of that, whether it was writing or kind of creative projects. And so that was held as kind of like the top value over academics, and we were all good students. I have 5 of us kids. So we went to good colleges. That was all on board, but really creativity, what was most rewarded or prized. And so from a young age, I think we collaborated a lot on that. And even to this day, my dad's into his late 60s. He'll still call me up. Hey, Casey, I have this idea. It's a space exploration novel, and this is what's going to happen. And we'll just riff for an hour and talk about it. So it's a great relationship. And I definitely think he was an influence on kind of seeding my love for writing.
That's so cool. I think that writing's a major skill that I think a lot of people, I'm envious of people who have it. Growing up, I felt like I had a lot in my brain that I wanted to get out, but I didn't have that skill to like really get it out. And I think that, through the podcast, I've been able to learn how to vocalize some of that stuff a little bit better. So I think this is more of my skill than putting it down on paper, but I envy you and I applaud you for writing the books and for enjoying what you do. That's pretty awesome, man. What are you currently working on that excites you? Do you feel like your website traffic is kind of in a slump right now? Or maybe over the last couple of weeks or months, it's actually dipped quite a bit and you cannot figure out what to do next? Go to fireusmarketing.com/meeting to schedule a free meeting with me where we can look at your website, talk about your frustrations, and see if there's anything that I can do to help you out. The meeting is absolutely free. There's no strings attached. If I can help you, I'd love to. Again, go to fireusmarketing.com/meeting. We'll talk to you soon.
Oh man, so ActiveCampaign, we have a lot of kind of fun projects in flight. We're setting up influencer initiatives, kind of getting deep into that. I'm learning a ton from where I started this year to now is like night and day with in terms of the experiments that I've run. We're getting really deep into short form video. So one of the things I'm most excited about, I launched a project called Impromptu Chats, and I said it was almost like a podcast, but it was like a quick, like they're going to hop on. We're not going to even publish the whole thing. We're just going to use short snippets. And we've generated, I think we're at like 800,000 views on those clips over the course of, I think we're at like week 7 or something. So it's been remarkable the reach we've been able to get on that content and the speed. And I just record them inside of Riverside and then export it into something called Opus Clip, which kind of helps grab certain, like it kind of pre-selects clips for you. You do a little light editing and then I'm just shooting that out. So I'm really bullish on short form video right now. And I think that especially like LinkedIn is starting to prioritize this. That's one area that I'm very bullish on. The other thing I'm really excited about is LinkedIn has really taken off at the point where I'm doing, probably will end this year about 10 million impressions on LinkedIn and just been kind of finding my style and my form. We were kind of talking about writing. I think for the longest time, I felt like my style was just too dry because I tend to be very actionable. Like this is what I'm actually doing. This is the experiment. And because of that, it wasn't super clickbaity or super like have a great hook, but I think I've kind of found my audience. I think I've found folks that appreciate that. They want to consume that type of content. And I've also realized that with LinkedIn, I post at a pretty high frequency, let's say 7 times a week. I have content all the time that only gets 2,000 views and I've stopped worrying about that. And, on an average week, I'll get probably 100 to 150,000 impressions per week. But it's like a post will just go off, get 50,000, get 100,000, and then lots of others will. And I've just kind of I'm just going to build in public. I'm going to keep sharing. And it started to kind of work out and get momentum. So those are 2 areas that have been pretty exciting.
That's a good strategy. And I think it's a good lesson, the LinkedIn part you mentioned. I think a lot of people, I've actually heard about influencers who post on their platform and within minutes, if it doesn't do what they want, they take it off. And I think that's a bad strategy. That's just my opinion. But I did a LinkedIn experiment, it's been like a year now, where I posted 100 days in a row, never missed 100 days. And I went back and analyzed what posts did better than others and stuff. There was really no rhyme or reason to like what did well. And I was the same way. I had some that had 1,000. I had some that had 10,000 or more. And I was like, what the heck? And I think it's just consistency. And it sounds like that's what you're doing. Be consistent, stop worrying about the smaller things, and the ones that take off. That's great. So that's awesome that you've got that many impressions over this last year. Keep going because I enjoy your content, and it looks like your audience is growing fast enough that I'm not the only one. So that's pretty awesome.
Yeah, appreciate you.
Yeah. Okay, so let's dive into the tactical part of this podcast where we talk about email marketing. I think that for the most part, most business owners probably understand that it exists. It's one of the older channels. I think most people, if they're new to business, they're probably like, "What's my biggest bang for my buck? My fastest thing?" Most people are going to be directed towards like paid ads, right? That if they want like long-term growth, they're looking at SEO. Email marketing, from what I've experienced from my clients and people I've coached from in the past, people, one, they don't know where to start. 2, they're worried they're going to say the wrong thing. Like maybe let's like at a high level, let's talk about what is email marketing, why it's important, why you should have newsletters. Like what advice do you have for these business owners who have never started email marketing and are just now getting into it?
Yeah, great question. So the first thing I want to kind of differentiate, because I think they're very different beasts in a way, is a newsletter versus email marketing. Right? Because a newsletter is a very specific instrument. And we can kind of go into some of the different things that newsletter can essentially serve, whether that's pipeline generation, or we can kind of go through that. Email marketing is obviously this much wider net. And inside of that net, I think there's a lot of different opportunities, whether it's to instill urgency or drive a specific promotion, or there's a whole vast array of things that you can kind of execute on email marketing. but sometimes we conflate those. And I do think that they're quite different. So that's kind of the first thing that I would note. Specifically around newsletters, I think one of the things is having owned assets is becoming more and more important, right? We're seeing algorithms change all the time. And I think that having access to data is becoming a competitive advantage. So that's where I think more and more brands are kind of looking and saying, hey, we're generating all these eyes on social, for example, or with video or with podcasts. But where are we taking that attention? Is there any spot where we're going to gain some ownership over that data and that ability to build a relationship after that? And that's where I think email and a newsletter specifically can be a really effective vehicle at that stage to take that attention, like tons of eyes you can generate at the top and start to do something a little bit more meaningful with it.
Do you have a preference on newsletter through, something like ActiveCampaign versus newsletter through something like LinkedIn?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, again, the first thing is just ownership, right? When you own it inside of a platform, you have way more control. So I think that's the first kind of advantage. And you can personalize and you can segment and you just have a ton of autonomy inside of that environment and a ton more visibility. So that is my preference. That being said, I'm all about distribution. So if you have good core content, use it in many places, right? You might have to repurpose it, reconfigure it. I never advocate to just like reuse blog content. I don't think that is the path to success. And we can talk about why that is. But I do think absolutely if you have good core research, good firsthand data, you can leverage it across different spots, 100%.
Okay. I love that. So let's focus just to be clear. The rest of our conversation will be on newsletters that you own. So you own the assets, you own the emails, all of that. So let's talk through that a little bit, just to sort of narrow the focus. So what key elements are important in a newsletter?
Yeah, great question. So I think the first thing is we're seeing a big shift towards personal voice. So the first thing is I think you want to start trying to move away from just generic, like repurposed blog content, and a couple things that are best practice. First is I really like name company from your send from address. I know it's a very kind of specific thing, but it's all part of trying to translate that there is an individual human behind this newsletter, but you're also trying to combine that authority with the brand, right? And I think it's that synergy which is producing the best effects. So at a first point, it's decide who you want writing and who's going to bring voice to this newsletter. Second, if you're talking about B2B newsletters in specific, I want folks to think about what information are you delivering that people cannot get anywhere else, right? If you look at Growth Unhinged by Kyle Poirier, if you look at Scaling SaaS, if you look at, there's a ton of examples that we can go through of top B2B newsletters. They deliver unique information that people aren't getting in other spots. And I think that is something that the best newsletters are very good at. So they have this voice of the actual author behind it that people kind of create emotional connection with. They're starting to bring in unique pieces of information. And in some ways, I think a good model is to think of it as an expansion of your social content in a way. So your social content might touch at a surface layer on subject and pique someone's interest. Oh, we're using influencer marketing. We're doing X, Y, Z. But that newsletter is the ability to then go that layer deeper, really unpack it. In B2B especially, don't be afraid to be long form. Bring the data, show the charts, really be transparent about that journey. And I think you gain a ton of trust through building a newsletter that acts in that capacity.
So you say that, the personalization is important. So that, the name of the person at the company, so they can see it's both company as well as a person behind it. In the writing style, is that the same? Does that person have, like, in my experience, or is it written as the company?
I think that writing it from the perspective of the individual is best. I think that's what creates the most emotional hooks and relatability to get people coming back. And it's the same thing. Like, I'm very bullish about driving replies. I look at it, and from a deliverability perspective, we won't go down the deliverability rabbit hole, but replies is one of the most important signals to put you in the primary folder. If you want to avoid promotions, if you want to not be hitting those alternative folders, you need to drive up your reply rate. Because when you're talking just casually with your coworkers or your family, it's like 80% reply rate, right? Whereas bulk messaging is like a 1-2% reply rate. So it's a very easy signal for that receiving inbox to filter you as promotional mail. But if you ask good targeted questions in your newsletters and you hike that rate up to even 10, 20%, you can absolutely land in primary, even with a very large list. And so I think that interactivity that you can foster also comes from having that personality and then having someone be able to interface back and forth with you.
Can you give me some examples of questions that you would use to get somebody to reply?
Yeah, for sure. So I like to be as specific as possible. So for example, if I'm doing a case study where I'm showing how a brand effectively used Facebook ads, right? I might ask someone directly, like, what is the biggest hurdle you're having right now with your Facebook ads? Very, very specific. I actually prefer that over just saying, like, what's your biggest problem with paid, right? Or we can keep extracting layers. What's your biggest problem in growth? The challenge is when you ask someone, what's your biggest problem in growth? They're like, where do I start, right? We got hiring problems, we got paid, we got organic. And when they have too many options, then they just don't reply because they're just like, it takes more mental bandwidth. Versus anyone who is working inside of Facebook, if you ask them, like, what is a major problem you're facing right there? That's a much more direct question and can get a much more pointed answer. Well, we're finding that we do really well when we spend up through this point, but then when we try to scale above that, we get stuck. Awesome. You now have a hook to have a really meaningful conversation with them.
I get a lot of emails from companies, and I sign up for a few newsletters. Most of the newsletters seem very salesy, not really like informational, trying to help me out. And I don't know that I would ever respond to a question like that. I might think it's like a rhetorical question. Is that just a matter of changing the way you send the emails, not making every single newsletter a sales letter and changing the tone to be more personal? Is that what is going to get people to actually respond to it?
Yeah, I mean, look, the days of the promotional newsletter are gone. That's my blunt opinion, right? Like, I am releasing a video soon that talks about how there's like two core styles. There's the creator style, which is like, I'm going to get firsthand data, unique research, and I'm going to present it. And then there's what I call the curator style, which is that I'm going to be an outlet to get all the most relevant news for you. I'm going to package it in one spot, and I'll often add a little bit of my analysis. So my opinions or feedback about different things. But there's so much information, so much data that that's an opportunity of, hey, I trust you as a person, and you are a shorthand for keeping me up to date about SEO, about insert whatever the thing is. So I think there's value in both the curator and the creator style. But the promotional newsletter, I just think that there is so much noise in the inbox. I would just say, like, it's done. Like, do not have a promotional focused newsletter. As we talked about, if you have an engaged audience, if you have a large audience, I am absolutely not saying don't send emails that promote products. But that's the differentiation between email marketing versus a newsletter. Use your newsletter as a vehicle to build trust, to build the emotional connection, to add value, to increase pipeline, to increase retention. Don't use it as just a way to huck sales. And occasionally, if every once in a while there's a plug that makes sense, like Scaling SaaS, for example, they have an event in September. It probably makes sense around that time when they're sending out their issues to let people know, hey, by the way, we have an event. But year round, I would not be constantly pushing people or have that be the focal point because you're going to lose that trust. And the biggest mistake, final thing I'll say on this is people who do incorporate in the sales element, they do it way, way too soon. They haven't built the relationship. They haven't built the trust. And they're on email 2, email 3, and they're already hawking something. It's like, that's a disaster. That's a recipe to do the opposite of what your intent is, which is to build trust with your audience. Yeah, it's a really good question. So I think with newsletters, it's super important to have an expectation to reality match. So one of the things I coach folks through when we're starting out is to be very, very intentional at saying each Friday, like as an example, each Friday at 8 a.m. PST, I'm going to send you a case study on how to scale your e-commerce store from 0 to 1 million. Like very, very specific. You're going to deliver it at the same time every single week, and you're going to tell someone exactly what it's about. And if you want to add a name, like I recently launched a newsletter called SaaS Steps. So I would have like SaaS Steps. It would be like Casey at SaaS Steps, and people would have the expectation that, that newsletter basically looks at software companies, and I break down each stage of their growth. From 0 to 1, this is what we did. From 1 to 10, this is what we did. And I built that because the pain point I saw was like, the advice that gets you from 100 million to a billion is so totally different from 0 to 1 that we're giving people all this generic advice, which is not remotely relevant. So let's break it down by stage to have that be more relevant. But I set that expectation very clearly about what they're going to receive from me and when they're going to receive it. And I think that is super key. And just kind of connected to that, I want to point people to a very specific example. If people aren't subscribed to Growth Unhinged by Kyle Poirier, I want you to subscribe, and I want you to look at his welcome message, because it's one of my favorite welcome emails, because it does all three of the core things that I like folks to do in one message. So the first thing is, it reiterates exactly what I just said. It says, I'm going to message you on Wednesday at this time about this subject. So that's the first thing you want to do. The second thing he does is he says, here's a bunch of related content that you can consume right now. A huge missed opportunity is you send your newsletter out, let's say once a month or even once a week. But when they subscribe, their intent is very high at that point. You want them to be able to engage more immediately. So it is a huge miss to not give them anything to consume right away. I go as far as to say, if you don't have at least one other quality article or piece to do, wait. Don't publish your newsletter until you can have at least one quality piece that you can direct someone towards. So that's number two. And the third thing is that targeted question, getting those replies, putting yourself in the primary inbox so you have a better shot at those higher engagement rates. Those three things are how you can create a masterful welcome message and get more engagement as you're starting. I think that design is valuable to the extent that it adds clarity and skimmability. So those are the two matrices. I see a blend. A lot of the top B2B newsletters that I follow when I go through do have some sort of design element. And part of that is to expound or contextualize. Like if I read an episode of Scaling SaaS, I'm usually going to see some charts. I'm going to see some data. I'm going to see some visualization of what we're talking about. And Growth Unhinged in the same way. They use those assets to make it more digestible and more skimmable. Hey, if I don't want to read this wall of text, I can get a quick snapshot version inside this graph, which tells me a little bit about where we're going, right? So I do not think, I've spent a long time in this industry, and I've gotten that question a ton of, well, Casey, will I inbox better if it's just plain text? Or is this going to put me in promotions if I add design? And I will tell, I've looked at this in a ton of different ways across a ton of different industries. And what I'll say is that it is all about the relevance to your audience. There is no trend that I've ever seen that says, hey, if I add visual elements, that means I'm not going to have a strong engagement or inboxing rate, right? But at the same point, if it's fluff, if you're adding, stock images and you're just adding stuff for the sake of adding it, and it's not contributing to either clarity or skimmability, then I think that is a mistake. So those are the two things I would think of as I'm adding visuals into my assets. Does it meet those criteria? If yes, excellent. If not, avoid. There's a newsletter called Marketing Examples by Harry Dry, who is a copywriter who I really admire. And he does an excellent job of using images, visuals to really clearly illustrate his point. They'll be like, before or after, or which of these three statements is memorable? And they use visuals really effectively there. He also uses just basic color gradients at the bottom of his emails to differentiate, like, if you want to share this, if you want more XYZ. And when you go through, it absolutely contributes to that, like skimmability and the clarity. His images are adding clarity. And at the bottom, it's really easy to skim and know what those things are telling you to do. So that's the way I would think about design.
That's great. What about frequency? Is there a number of times that somebody should be sending an email out? Once a week, once a month, every other week? Or is it more about just being consistent with whatever you decide?
Yeah, it's more about being consistent.
Okay.
And the reality is it's about how often you can message people with quality content. So for example, when I set up SaaS Steps, it takes a long time to get founders of large software companies like onto a call to coordinate, to make sure they don't need to redact anything that was said. And so I couldn't at a quality level go for more than once a month. It just wouldn't be tenable, right? But in another situation, if someone has the ability to, once a week, I think is better than once a month in terms of you're getting more frequency of engagement. So that's a more ideal tempo if you can pull it off. And then there's the extremes of the Morning Brew and Robinhood Snacks, and they message every single day. And they have millions of followers because they've built an apparatus that can deliver that at a level of quality. So I would say that focus just on what you can do sustainably. But that being said, the higher frequency when it is quality and sustainable will tend to give you more.
Okay. So since newsletters are not technically meant for sales, how do you measure the effectiveness of it? Is it open rates? Is it clicks? What's the best way to understand if it's successful or not?
Yeah, great question. So the first thing I think is to walk through the engagement metrics and what actually matters. So opens are the least reliable. Opens are the worst metric because after Apple Auto opens and a lot of other changes that have happened in our industry, those are massively inflated, right? And I won't go down the rabbit hole, but not only is there the problem with Apple opens, but many brands, if you have someone who opens an email twice, they will actually double count that open and use that as a way to inflate your numbers as well. So there's a lot of manipulation in the game because all the email providers, right? They're like, hey, we want your open rates to look as high as possible. So that's the worst. What is better than opens? It's clicks, right? Clicks are better, but even clicks do have a little bit of challenge. There's things like Barracuda, which check for malware and they automatically open and hit every single link in your email to make sure that there's not malware. And so it's much better than opens because that's done less, but there still can be challenges like on Microsoft oriented inboxes that can run into problems with clicks. Now, better than clicks is page views. So what happens is when it goes through and it auto clicks, those actually are all bounces. So they're just checking. It's not actually going to the page. So if you have a pixel on your actual landing page and someone actually hits that pixel, not as a bounce, that is a much more reliable signal of engagement. So I encourage folks to add a pixel onto your website and be looking at what page they hit initially. And if you have the capacity, also what pages do they go to? It's really helpful information. And then the gold standard, the top of the podium is replies. Replies is the most human. It has the deepest emotional connection to your newsletter. So I want to start there because that is the ranking. Opens, then clicks, then page views, then replies. So in terms of when you're looking at, am I getting engagement? That's where I would start. The next thing is newsletters can serve different purposes, right? You can have more company focused newsletters, customer focused newsletters. They're focused on retention. They're focused on adoption. They're focused on taking people into case studies and making it accessible, sharing templates with them. That's totally a viable use case. Come in with the intentionality though, of having it be to that specific goal. I'm going to try to get as many customers as possible. I'm going to look at that cohort and see how they retain, right? That's different from what I think is probably maybe the most common, which is a little bit more of that mid funnel to maybe even slightly top of funnel pipeline building. What is scaling SaaS or growth unhinged or do what works or a lot of my favorite B2B newsletters? They are sharing really valuable, unique information to bring people in and develop those relationships and try to turn those people into customers ultimately. So I think at a core level, understand what engagement metrics matter, but go into it from a standpoint of having a direct goal in advance. Because that's the other problem. Newsletters have changed so dramatically over the last decade. And today you cannot be an amalgamation of everything, right? That just doesn't work. If you go into a newsletter and you try to just be like, we're company updates and we're doing this and, like people tune out. Too many CTAs, too much noise. You want to be very, very targeted and intentional. That's how you don't break that expectation to reality linkage.
Dig in a little bit more to the pixel. Is that an analytics pixel? Is it something that comes from is it like, to my understanding, and maybe just correct me, but to my understanding, if you were to put a link in the email and somebody clicks on it, there's like a UTM code or a tracker that goes to the website. Is there something like within ActiveCampaign or the email providers that gives you the pixel to put on your website? Or are we just talking like a Google Analytics setup and making sure it's there so you can track all the way through?
Yeah, so there's actually a pixel from tools like ActiveCampaign. You can just add that pixel in and you can either apply it globally. So it goes to all your pages. You can apply it to select pages, but it then will track all that web traffic. And you can understand how people are interacting, not just in your email, but also on your website. And so I think that's a really important thing to give you more depth. And a lot of providers, I think, have things like that, like a pixel that you can apply to your website for visibility.
Okay, awesome. What about segmentation? I know there's a lot of segmentation within email marketing. Do we do the same for newsletters?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think segmentation, personalization are super important. So the first thing that I tend to tell people is have dynamic and static, right? So static means specific questions you ask up front. What is your company size? What industry are you in? What is your role? That type of thing. What I tell people when it comes to static information is focus on what you're going to meaningfully send different information based on, right? So if you're going in and you're like, well, I just want to gather all this information, but I'm not actually going to send them down different paths. Wait until you're ready. If that's where you're starting, that's okay. But then just get the name and email, right? Don't make it harder. Don't add friction before you have the ability to add meaningful differentiation. But when you're in a different situation where you're like, look, we serve B2B SaaS and we serve e-commerce, and their journeys look really different and the stuff they care about is really different, then absolutely ask industry or company size. We serve, 5-person mom and pop shops and also enterprise brands with 10,000 employees. Almost guaranteed that journey looks super different, right? So when that person's coming in, you can ask them that question. And I think it's really meaningful. And so I would be sparing with it. Morning Brew is an example. Morning Brew, if anyone goes to opt into Morning Brew, they have like an 11-page opt-in process. It is intensive, but they can do that because they've built up such a reputation and they're now like that data is like one of their competitive assets. Because they're the top dog, they can pull that off. If you're starting out and you don't have that reputation, you're probably not in those shoes. So maybe ask 1 to 2 specific targeted questions. Then there's dynamic segmentation. Dynamic segmentation is based on what people actually do once they get to your email. What do they click on? What do they check out? Do they reply? If they go to your website, where do they go on your website? Right? That's kind of stuff can be really important. If I'm running a newsletter and I have tracking on my website and I see that there's a cohort of my newsletter that's going to my pricing page, maybe even going to my pricing page multiple times, well, that's good. That's good intelligence, right? That's something that might indicate that person is very engaged. And at the very least, maybe I start messaging them more frequently. Clearly, they're highly engaged. I would try to capitalize on that momentum, right? Other times, newsletters might be broken down into having like sections. So you might have a section that's like customer story of the week. And if there's people that love your customer stories, why don't you invite them maybe to join one of your communities, right? And get them kind of pulled in a little bit more. Whereas you have another cohort, they open every email, they never click on the customer story. That is not the main thing they care about. So then don't send that person down that path. So I don't want to overcomplicate it because again, it can feel very daunting for folks. So the simplified version when it comes to personalization is, as a starting point, if you can do something meaningful with it, ask one question up front. That's the static segmentation. And then the second one is, if there's just one basic signal that you can look at, like this group always checks out this thing, then take that into consideration. And if nothing else, you might not even change your flow, but your team might send them a different email marketing message separate from the newsletter that is tied in some way to that intent and help you, if you're trying to build pipeline, convert those people over into customers.
So if we go back a step where you're talking about the 4 different types of metrics, the first one you mentioned was open rate, not super reliable. But if somebody doesn't open it, you're not going to get any of the other 3. So what recommendations do you have for the title and the subject in writing those in a compelling way to get somebody to click in and at least take that first step?
Yeah, for sure. So I think that what you want to do, there's a couple kind of fields of thought.
Yeah.
So the first thing I'll say is it is important to kind of like generate interest, but a lot of people kind of conflate that with being clickbaity. And so I want to kind of maybe paint an example of how you can differentiate between those two things. So if someone says like the real reason in all caps why marketing attribution will never work, and then someone clicks into that message, but you don't deliver on that promise, the person doesn't really explain it, they don't really justify it, that is what feels clickbaity. What feels clickbaity is my promise was not met. You got my open, but now I'm less likely to engage in the future. A good example of something that I think can be a compelling hook, right? But might almost sound similar, but I'll explain. I recently ran a messaging based on one of my most viral recent posts. Rand Fishkin, who's a guy who's well known in the SEO space. I had him on my podcast and he said something really provocative. He said, I'd rather have 100 emails than a million TikTok followers. And that's like a real whoa, shocking statement, right? It almost sounds a little clickbaity, but then he takes out his whiteboard and he walks through exactly why he thinks that is the case. So the difference that I want to paint, both of those subject lines that I mentioned can seem maybe a little ooh, I'd rather have 100 emails than a million TikTok followers. That seems kind of controversial, but what do you back it up with? Is there data? Is there a real conversation around why that is? And if the answer is yes, you match expectation to reality, then that's okay. That's just an intriguing subject line versus I draw someone in, I don't deliver, that's clickbait. So I think that's the first side, I would say. The second thing that I've learned, not just from email, but also from social, so many people focus on piquing interest. They don't focus on the authority piece. And that is a huge missing cog to the equation. You can say all the crazy provocative stuff you want, but who are you? Why should I pay attention to you? Why do you have authority to tell me this thing? That is a major missing piece. As an example, and some people might not be familiar with Rand, but he's pretty well known in the SEO space. He founded Moz, one of the biggest companies. So when he says something, it carries a lot more authority than if some, middle manager said it, right? And so I mentioned that to say that there's this authority component to any statements you make that's important. And if you're not in a position where you've maybe accumulated that authority, that's okay. But then maybe go to the industry. How can you leverage someone else that has put out information or research or some sort of other conversation thread where you can maybe borrow in some of that authority to drive home that point? Hey, it's not just coming from me. This was said by the head of Shopify. This was said by the head of PayPal. You're bringing that authority component in. So that is kind of the way that I would think about it. All of this said, though, I want to do a big disclaimer. As you're testing, as you're iterating, focus first on clarity over everything, right? If you're oh, Casey, I'm not sure, I don't know how to write this compelling, I would always rather you just tell in that messaging, say you're doing case studies about how a company goes, just be very direct. How Thinkific went from 0 to 50 million. How Active Campaign went from 0 to 250 million. Tell me exactly what I'm going to get. That's the most important thing. You don't need to get fit. Tell me exactly what you're going to get. That's the most important thing. And then after that, if you want to do a little experimentation, you can, but also remember, it doesn't have to be just in the core subject line. It can also be in the preview text. So for example, I might say how Active Campaign grew from 0 to 250 million. And in that little preview snippet, I might say how through, and then I might list 3 specific levers that might be used to pull an attention and make it feel more concrete, where someone's oh, they mentioned influencer marketing. Oh, they mentioned going global early. I'm interested in that thing, so I'm going to click in. But it's actually not even in the subject line. It's in the preview text. So make sure you use both of those assets to your advantage.
That's great advice. What about from a legal perspective? Is there anything that you need to be aware of, like GDPR or anything like that? What's in your footer? Do you have unsubscribe? What other legal considerations does somebody need to consider when writing a newsletter?
Yeah, I'm not a GDPR expert. Obviously, being in this space, I'm familiar with globally what it is. I can tell folks that especially if you're based in the EU, there's more stipulations even than in the US around these things. So really at a core level, it's don't cold email people. Make sure that you're taking people inbound. Make sure that you're being clear about what people are going to receive. So a good example is if someone purchases a product that has been kind of de facto, they opted in. And for a very long time, people are oh, cool, you bought this sweater. So that means that you're interested in my newsletter about our sustainability practices. And it's in many cases, no, that's not true. And I would advise that folks don't just try to use that as anyone who's ever interacted with my brand, I can message them about anything. Because it's all about your domain reputation. This is your golden asset, right? It's the same reason why, of course, you should always have an unsubscribe button. It's illegal to not have an unsubscribe button if you're doing bulk mailing, but also don't make it hard. Let me be very clear about this. You want people to unsubscribe. If someone does not want to receive your content, if they unsubscribe, that does not hurt you in any way. In fact, it means the portion of remaining people are more engaged. What hurts you is when they spam. What hurts is if you make that hard and then they're like, this is frustrating, I'm being spammed, and then they go ahead and click that. Or even if they just filter you into some alternative folder, never open any of your messages, that's not what you want. You want them to say, oh, I'm not interested in this content, I'm going to unsubscribe. And it is absolutely okay and even advisable to have what I call a preference center. A preference center says, hey, totally cool. You don't want this email about our sustainability practices. Do you still want to know when we do product releases? Do you still want to be called on to be a beta tester? You can allow them to make that selection. Yeah, I don't want any of this, but give me this stuff. Preference center, great idea. But do not make it a barrier. Do not make it hard for folks to be able to unsubscribe. I think that is probably one of the most important. And don't cold email people. If you're talking about legality, if you're focused, the whole cold emailing is like kind of a different world. I know some businesses gain a lot of growth from it. I don't really want to have a debate about that, but I'll say purely from a legalistic standpoint, right? Inbound is bad.
So along those same lines, giving people the option to unsubscribe, and you talk about, maybe you're just set up to go in a folder. How often do you recommend somebody does or goes through and does like list hygiene, where it's like, hey, this person hasn't opened an email for 12 months. Let's just kick them out. Like, how often do you do that to clean up your list and make sure you're actually sending it to people who care?
Yeah, 60 to 90 days, right? Like literally 1 quarter, 60 to 90 days. If folks are completely disengaged across that, typically remove them. And one of the reasons I say that too is because, again, in this broader umbrella of email marketing, usually your newsletter is not the only touch point. So when I say no engagement, it's like, hey, if they're just not opening your newsletter, that's one thing. But if they're not opening your newsletter and they're not opening your, launch message that you sent out about this great new thing that you're releasing, and they're also not opening that you just hired this all-star from Apple and whatever other stuff you guys are sending out, that's an overall signal. If it's been 3 months and they haven't touched a single email from you, unsubscribe them, clean that list out. And I think that's definitely best practice. And if that person ultimately wants at any point to come back into the flow, you'll have on your website the opt-ins, you'll have opportunities for them to do that. So they can come pop back in anytime they want, but you'll be better off from culling your list.
That's awesome. What other advice would you give to business owners starting a newsletter that maybe we haven't talked about yet? Okay, listen up real quick. I promise I'm going to get you right back to the episode. But are you frustrated that your product or service isn't getting the right amount of visibility it deserves online? If so, and you want my help guiding you through the SEO optimization, go to fireusmarketing.com/SEO to get my free SEO guide. Talks about all levels of SEO, local SEO, regional SEO, national SEO, and international SEO. It should give you everything you need to optimize your website at a basic level. If you'd like help beyond that, feel free to hit me up at fireusmarketing.com. I'd be happy to jump on a call and talk through your needs. Now let's get back to this episode.
Yeah, I think at a fundamental level, it really starts with come in with a goal, come in with intentionality, right? That's the first core thing. And with that intentionality, it also even relates to vendor selection. So if someone's early in this process, someone comes to me, hey, Casey, I want to set up a newsletter. And one of the things I'd like to do is I'd like to just send really good information. I'd actually like to monetize my subscribers themselves. Someone said that to me, I'm like, oh, awesome, Substack. That is the platform that does the thing that you are looking for. You're trying to monetize. Your payment path is through the subscribers themselves, right? So that would be the path I would point someone. Because someone's like, hey, I'm a solopreneur. I just built a course. I'm trying to figure out how I can kind of build some audience up and maybe sell that and possibly kind of get connected to other creators that are growing. I'd look at that and I'd say, okay, ConvertKit, Beehive, those are the kind of tools that are built for that thing, right? Which is to send email and also to have that path to sell a product and have that kind of creator network. Someone comes to me and they say, hey, Casey, I'm a small business. I have 6 employees and we're looking to have not only a newsletter, but we want to have a couple different ways that we market and communicate with our audience. So it's not just a newsletter, but at this point, it's an overall marketing strategy. That's where things like ActiveCampaign fit in really well for a lot of reasons, for the fact that it's looking at your website, for the fact that you can communicate across email, but also SMS, personal video, like all these different channels. So I mentioned that scaffolding and I mentioned that context because a lot of times it's really hard to navigate platforms. Everyone has opinions. Obviously, I have opinions. Obviously, I worked for a player in the space. And really what I found from being in this industry for a very long time is a lot just ties into what are you trying to accomplish, right? And a lot of these tools are fixed for different niches and for different focus areas. And so that's something I'd be aware of. Have a clear goal, select a vendor that's aligned to what you're fundamentally trying to do. And then the final thing is, for the love of God, whoever you have writing it, let them be expressive. Let them talk in a way that's authentic. Don't get so buttoned down with your brand voice and is this person using the right word? That is how you're going to lose people. The future is personality led. And as personality led, you need to let people bring that personality out in conversations. The stifling of that is one of the biggest reasons that newsletters don't stand out. They just become another boilerplate of, hey, let's go redistribute our blog content through another channel. And then it's just throwaway. You're going to get your 18% open rates, right? And you're going to get almost no responses. And it really doesn't become a compelling asset. Whereas the best newsletters, I talk to a lot of people that have the best newsletters. You're talking 60, sometimes 70% with 20,000, 30,000, 50,000 subscribers. I mean, the numbers are wild. And not only that, but hundreds of replies, tons of click-throughs, tons of real engagement signals. And that comes from having a voice, that comes from having unique information and data that people can't get in other places. So I think there's so much context as we've kind of covered, but I think those are just some of the fundamentals.
Speaking of being bullish on short clips, that last piece of advice is definitely going to be a social clip. that was great advice.
I love it.
Casey, where do you see the future going in email and newsletters?
Yeah. So, I mean, personality led, I know I hammered on that one about 3 times. But the other thing I think too is I'm very bullish also on the creator ecosystem, right? And this idea that a lot of times third-party authority can be really compelling. And we're at a weird time because it's almost starting to get a little saturated and people are kind of have their blinders up of like, oh, is this just another influencer promotion? Person doesn't really care about this. They just want to collect a paycheck. I think that is going to increasingly fall. But I think that you're going to see people that are kind of authentic ambassadors of these brands that just kind of build in public, talk about what they do. Like I mention tools all the freaking time. If anyone goes to my feed, you'll see I'm constantly, because that's the world I live in. I live in the SaaS world. The average SaaS company uses like 100 tools. So I'm vocal about the stuff that's working in my ecosystem. And I think that's going to be increasingly important. And how that correlates into the email side is you're going to see more and more that is an effective distribution system is outside creators, outside ambassadors talking about amplifying that content. So I think that's really important. And just the last thing I'll note on that is I did a post today where I talked about internal and external activation. And what I meant by that is when I go to launch an asset, a podcast episode, a big video, a whatever important release, I both try to activate my internal team. How do I get all the departments and people jumping in there? But I also have an external activation plan. So the external activation plan means I go and look at my network and I say, who is this really interesting or valuable to? If I do a video about how to, better monetize your podcast, I'm going to go talk to all these podcast hosts, done hundreds and hundreds of podcast appearances. It seems like that might intuitively make sense that people that are in that space would care about that content. So if I reach out and said, hey, I just compiled a ton of data from my experience on what's working with XYZ, if that would be valuable to your audience, just wanted to let you know. A lot of those people will look at that and they'll be like, oh, yeah, I'm happy to share that if it's genuinely valuable. So coming at your strategy with that in mind, distribution, how am I going to get distribution? I think can be really powerful. And the last little tidbit I'll say on this is a pickup that I've had that I try to incorporate into my own podcast is I like to ask targeted questions. I'll give you an example. I had 2 really big tech icons on my show. And I said, what is your favorite AI tool of 2024? One of them said Opus Clip. One of them said Intercom. After that episode was recorded, of course, I reached out and I said, hey, we got Wade Foster. He's the founder of Zapier. And he said his favorite AI tool is Intercom for this year. And of course, they blow it up and they use their huge distribution to point eyes. So sometimes, whether it's a newsletter, whether it's your social strategy, being intentional about asking questions that could bring in outside distribution is a really smart play to get more total eyes on that same content.
Casey, that's all powerful, man. I've loved this conversation. This is so much value has been added in this episode. I really appreciate you taking the time and joining us. I know you have a busy schedule. I know you're on lots of different podcasts. So the fact that you took time to be on this podcast means a lot to me. So I really appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, it was a ton of fun. I hope we gave people a little bit of guidance in the newsletter world.
Yeah, I hope so too. I think so. I think there's going to be a lot of short clips. I think there's going to be some good long form out of this. And so again, appreciate that. And to everyone else who's listening out there, we'll talk to you guys next week.